In 1943, inside a guarded camp in Texas, a woman went into labor. Outside the hospital, armed guards watched the gates. Barbed wire cut the camp off from the rest of America. Her family could not leave. Then, hours later, a baby cried for the first time. Born in Texas, born behind the wire. The child had never seen Germany, had never chosen a side, had never committed a crime. But somewhere in the machinery of wartime America, the baby's future was already being tied to the people imprisoned around her. And when the gates finally opened, the family wasn't being sent into America. They were not being sent into America. They were being sent out of it, and theirs would not be the only child's life to take that exact shape. By the middle of 1945, government hospital records at that one camp in South Texas listed at least 153 births behind its fence. Further north and west, hospital logs across 10 War Relocation Authority camps recorded 5,181 more, plus another 504 born in the temporary assembly centers that came before them. None of these facilities were prisoner of war camps. And once that fact surfaces, the entire premise of the question changes. No captured soldier ever lived behind the wire in South Texas. No one there wore a military uniform. The place had guard towers, roll calls, and a fence line running for miles, all the physical apparatus of a prison. But the legal system running it was not the one built by the Geneva Convention for enemy combatants. It was something else, a system built for a different category of person entirely, the enemy alien, the family dependent, the diplomatic hostage. That distinction should have made the camp easier to classify. Instead, it made the newborns inside it almost impossible to define. The War Relocation Authority alone held roughly 120,000 people of Japanese descent, forcibly removed from the West Coast, 2/3 of them already American citizens by birth, before a single one of them was born inside a camp. The infants born there afterward were not creating some new, unprecedented category of citizen prisoner. They were being added to one that already numbered in the tens of thousands. Before any of them were born, their mothers carried them through conditions the government's own hospital staff struggled to manage. At the Seagoville camp, the stress of internment was severe enough that several pregnant women miscarried. Decades later, researchers studying vital statistics from the period found that infants born to incarcerated Japanese-American mothers weighed, on average, 59 to 81 grams less than infants born to mothers who were never detained. A measurable, population-wide shift traced directly to malnutrition and psychological strain behind the fences. The camps did not just confine these children after birth. In a documented, physiological sense, they had already reached them before it. On September 23, 1944, a girl named Krista Schmitz was born inside the camp hospital at Crystal City, Texas. The same camp, the same hospital wing described in the scene that opened this story. Her birth was recorded the way any Texas birth would be, with one line that made the certificate unlike almost any other document that state had ever produced. Her place of birth read, Texas Department of Health, Zavala County, Precinct Measure 3, Alien Internment Camp, Crystal City, Texas. One government form had done two things at once. It had made her a United States citizen, and it had permanently attached the words alien and camp to that citizenship in the state's own official language. The certificate proved where Krista had been born. It did not answer what she now was. Not every birth followed the same script. 11 months earlier, on January 12, 1943, a woman interned at Seagoville was granted a rare temporary release for one purpose only, to give birth somewhere other than the camp. She was taken to a laundromat in Dallas. Her daughter Joanna was born there, then both of them were returned to internment once the paperwork allowed it. A government willing to fly armed guards and processing officers around a woman's labor still could not decide, county to county, camp to camp, whether these births belonged inside the fence or outside it. To understand how a document like that came to exist, it helps to follow one specific family from the beginning. Not because their case was unusual, but because of everyone who passed through this system, theirs is the most completely documented. Matthias and Johanna Iserloh were German immigrants who had built an ordinary life in Ohio before the war reclassified them as a national security concern. Neither had a record of political activity worth noting. Matthias was arrested as an enemy alien anyway and interned on the kind of thin, associational suspicion. a club membership, a subscription, a neighbor's report that swept up thousands of German and Italian immigrants who had never expressed loyalty to anyone but their own households. Johanna was left behind with children to feed, a frozen bank account, and neighbors who now treated her as a suspect by association. At one point, she fought off a home intruder with a lead pipe, alone. Not long after, she made the decision that would define the rest of her family's life. She petitioned to join her husband behind the fence. The government's term for what she did was voluntary internment. In practice, it was closer to a trade. Refusing meant staying free, penniless, and separated. Accepting meant walking behind barbed wire on purpose, in exchange for food, shelter, and a father back in the household. Johanna signed the papers. Inside Crystal City, daily life took on a strange manufactured normalcy. Internees had dug a 250-foot swimming pool out of a swamp, ringed by the same guard towers watching the camp's perimeter. Families paid for groceries with plastic camp tokens instead of U.S. currency. The camp hospital was staffed partly by American doctors and partly by interned ones, including 2 Japanese physicians who found themselves delivering babies for German and Italian families they would never have met outside the fence. A child born here would grow up in a place with a school, a hospital, and even a prom, built entirely inside a federal detention system. In 1944, 2 young Japanese Peruvian girls drowned in that same swimming pool, a reminder, if anyone needed one, that a recreational amenity behind a fence does not undo what the fence is. The Iserlohs settled into that rhythm, and in 1944 Johanna became pregnant again. A pregnancy inside Crystal City did not pause the machinery running the camp. It ran alongside it. Exchange lists were still being drawn up. Repatriation voyages for the internees themselves, the parents, the ones the government had actually classified as enemy aliens, were still being scheduled month to month. A baby did not appear on those lists before it existed, but its mother did, and wherever the mother's name moved next, the newborn would eventually have to move with her. This was the closest thing to an answer for what these infants legally were. Not prisoners in the strict sense. No arrest warrant was ever issued for a newborn. Not quite ordinary civilians either, since a civilian can walk to a gate and leave through it. They were citizens by birth and captives by circumstance, with their legal status and their physical freedom pointing in 2 different directions at once. The 14th Amendment resolved half of that contradiction without argument. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. The government never disputed this. Every infant born inside these fences, German, Italian, Japanese, Peruvian, received a standard American birth certificate, identical in form to any other hospital birth in the country. Their citizenship was never contested. Their freedom was a separate matter, and the government treated it as one. A newborn cannot walk through a gate alone. Legal status meant nothing without someone willing or able to carry it out the door. In the War Relocation Authority camps, the same machinery operated on the parents directly. Fathers were required to answer a set of so-called loyalty questionnaires worded in ways that could brand a man disloyal for the wrong answer to a single line, a classification that could separate him from his own children on paper, even while they remained in the same camp. A newborn's status depended on a parent's answers to a form the infant would never see and could not have understood if they had. Some documents made this collision explicit in smaller ways. In the War Relocation Authority camps further west, infants were fingerprinted and photographed for their own government identification. Wallet-sized Citizens Indefinite Leave cards, a baby's footprint printed beside a federal tracking number. A girl named Diane Oki, born at Heart Mountain in October 1943, was photographed being fingerprinted for one of these cards at 5 months old. One former Crystal City child, recalling his own version of this normalized captivity years later, put it simply, "You just didn't have freedom to move." Krista Schmitz's arrival in the record books actually worked in her family's favor. A larger household took longer to process, which meant more time before any exchange or removal notice arrived. For the Iserlohs, a new baby would have the opposite effect. It would not delay anything. It would simply travel with them. The Iserlohs were far from the only family whose American citizen children became part of someone else's paperwork. In August 1942, a woman named Blanca Rosa Kettelhorn gave birth to a daughter, Maria Helene, inside the Segoville camp, 7 months after U.S. authorities removed her, pregnant from Nicaragua, and transported her north, specifically to serve as leverage in a prisoner exchange. She had broken no law in either country. She had simply been useful. The following year, a boy named Tsuneo Larry Oda was born at Crystal City to the family of a Japanese community leader the FBI had arrested. Decades later, federal courts would cite his case in arguments over the outer limits of birthright citizenship. A boy named Teruhiko Terry Maoki was born there too, to a family taken from Peru for the same reason the Kettelhorns had been taken from Nicaragua, because the United States needed more hostages than its own enemy alien population could supply, and Latin American governments were willing to hand them over. The mechanics of that program added a final layer of absurdity to the paperwork. Families kidnapped from Latin America arrived at ports like New Orleans, where U.S. officials confiscated their passports and then classified them as illegal aliens, undocumented by a government that had personally removed their documents. A child born to one of these families, like Terry Maoki, was born a U.S. citizen to parents the same government had just declared didn't legally belong anywhere. It would take a civil rights attorney, Wayne Collins, years of correspondence to even begin untangling the Maoki family's status enough to fight their deportation. None of these were isolated anomalies inside one strange camp. They were the same system, repeating itself, family after family, year after year. For the Iserlohs, the paperwork arrived in the final weeks of 1944. Johanna, heavily pregnant, was informed the family had been selected for repatriation. The government's word, even though the American-born children in the family had nowhere in Germany to actually be repatriated to. Refusal was rarely a real option inside the system. Johanna and Matthias signed. What followed was not a single dramatic departure, but a sequence of small procedural steps, each one moving the family further from Texas. Names were added to an exchange manifest, belongings were reduced to what a family could carry onto a train, a departure date was set, then confirmed, then acted on. None of it looked urgent on paper. All of it was. The family left Crystal City by train in early January 1945, headed toward a port, and eventually an exchange ship. Somewhere along that route, Johanna went into labor. On January 4th, 1945, under armed guard, inside a moving railcar, she gave birth to a son. They named him Günther. He had been inside the United States for a matter of hours before the country began transporting him out of it. The ship waiting for the family was the MS Gripsholm, a Swedish ocean liner chartered under the protection of the International Red Cross, painted entirely white. Lit up at night so no submarine crew could mistake it for a military target, it sailed to neutral ports far from the front lines, Lourenço Marques in Mozambique, Mormugao in India, where families like the Iserlohs walked down one side of a dock while American citizens being freed from enemy territory walked up the other. One family handed over for one returning American, a newborn for a released prisoner. Germany, in the opening months of 1945, was not a country so much as a collapsing target. Allied bombers were still striking the rail lines, ports, and cities the Iserlohs would have to pass through to reach whatever remained of their pre-war hometown. Günther was weeks old. He had never seen anything but a Texas hospital ledger's worth of paperwork and a Swedish ship's passenger manifest. Now he was entering a war zone as a citizen of the very country still bombing it. When the family reached Germany, Matthias was detained and beaten by the Gestapo, who suspected that a man arriving from the United States might be an American intelligence asset. For a period of weeks, a newborn United States citizen was living inside Nazi Germany, sheltered by a father the regime itself had just finished interrogating as a suspected spy. None of the paperwork that made Günther an American citizen traveled with him in any form that mattered on the ground. The certificate existed in a government office in Texas. The child existed in a bombed country 3 continents away, too young to understand either fact. The camp Günther had been born fleeing did not close when the war did. Crystal City remained open until February 1948, nearly 3 years after Germany's surrender. A girl named Dillis Neugebauer was born there in March 1946, to a German father and English mother deported from Costa Rica 7 months after the fighting had officially ended. The war was over. The legal machinery that had produced Gunther's birth certificate was not. The legal contradiction did not end when the camps did either. Courts would later examine the case of a boy named Frank Tanaka, a U.S. citizen by birth, whose Japanese-American parents were pressured into renouncing their own American citizenship under the same wartime duress that had put them behind fences in the first place. His case became legal precedent for just how far a family's forced choices could reach into a child's own status, years after the barbed wire itself was gone. Elsewhere, the post-war arithmetic was just as uneven. Wes Wesselhoft, interned at Crystal City as a 6-year-old and later traded to Germany alongside his family, eventually returned to the United States and served as a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force, a citizen the country had once shipped to its enemy, later flying for it instead. Families released from camps inside the United States were told, in some cases explicitly, never to speak of their internment again. It would be more than 4 decades before Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, formally apologizing to the Japanese American families who had lived through the wider system Crystal City belonged to. For the Iserlohs, the return took even longer than that apology did to arrive. Gunther's older siblings, Ingrid and Lothar, were permitted back into the United States in 1947. Their parents were not. Matthias and Johanna would not be allowed to re-enter the country until 1955, a full decade after their American-born son had been born inside it, under guard, on a moving train, in the middle of a war. None of this happened inside a single camp, to a single family, under a single legal theory. It happened across DOJ family camps and WRA incarceration sites, under the Alien Enemies Act and Executive Order 9066, to German, Italian, Japanese, and Japanese Latin American families who often had nothing in common except the fence around them and the citizenship of the children born behind it. Krista Schmitz's birth certificate had listed her birthplace as an alien internment camp and her citizenship as American on the same line without contradiction because both were simply true. Gunther Iserloh's earliest identity was built from the same raw material. An American birthplace, a citizenship no government official ever disputed, and 10 years spent somewhere else entirely because the adults responsible for him had no legal way to bring him home sooner. He was an American citizen from the hour he was born. It took his family a decade to get him back to the country that made him one.